There he is again. Does he really think anyone cares about that old plane? What secret does this quiet man hold? Muttered a young recruit at the guard post with a mocking grin. Under the dim light from the Arizona Air Base, George slowly moved a cloth over the fuselage of the Old Republic F-105 Thunder Chief. The metal gleamed under his careful strokes. They had no idea, but they were about to find out that the man they mocked was a living legend, and that discovery would change their lives forever. Let's dive into this story. George Murphy lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town, not far from the airbase. He had retired from the Air Force decades ago. But George never truly left that world behind. At 84, every single day without fail, he drove to the main gate of the base. And every single day without fail, he quietly walked over to the F-105 Thunder Chief that stood at the entrance like a monument. The plane had been there for years, an open-air museum piece most people snapped a quick photo of before moving on. But for George, it was different. He knew every rivet on that fuselage, every curve of those wings. He knew the roar of those engines as they climbed into the sky, and the haunted silence that followed a mission completed. George never spoke about the past. When someone from the base greeted him, he'd offer a polite nod and go back to his work. When they asked why he kept cleaning the plane, he'd simply say, "Someone's got to take care of it." Every morning, his presence had become part of the base's scenery. The guards recognized him by sight. The administrative officers and young pilots saw him as a curious but harmless figure. The old man, with a strange fixation on vintage aircraft. The teasing started off subtle. "The Guardian's here early today," announced Blake, a young recruit who had spent the night on gate duty. He had come up with an elaborate theory that George was a retired base mechanic now suffering from empty hangar syndrome, a completely made-up condition he described in comical detail during morning briefings. Symptoms include a compulsive need to polish metal and imaginary conversations with aircraft, Blake would say, drawing laughs from everyone in the room. Matthew, another young man on base, joined in on the jokes, too, but always with a hint of hesitation. There was something about George's posture that struck him. George didn't clean that plane like it was a chore. He did it like it was a tribute. The teasing escalated when a rookie pilot suggested they take up a collection to buy George better cleaning supplies. "Poor guy's probably using dish soap from home," the young man joked, sparking another round of laughter. But George kept to his routine, unfazed. If he heard the jokes, he didn't show it. He arrived early, cleaned in silence, and left quietly. His dedication never wavered. His dignity remained untouched. To the young pilots, his calm demeanor only confirmed what they believed. He was just a lonely old retiree trying to feel useful. They had no idea how wrong they were. And they had no idea that their ignorance was about to be shattered completely and irreversibly by the weight of reality. Could this old man's past rewrite his legacy? The shift began on a Tuesday when an anonymous call came into the base's security department. "There's an elderly man who shows up at the main gate every day," said a concerned voice. "He messes with the display aircraft and no one really checks his ID. I thought you should look into it." Sergeant William Torres, head of internal security, jotted down the report with a hint of skepticism. He recognized George by sight. The man had been coming to the base for years without causing a single issue. But rules are rules, especially on military grounds. The next morning, Torres approached George as he was wiping down the right wing of the F-105. "Sir, we need to talk," Torres said, trying to sound respectful. George stopped what he was doing and turned around. His eyes were calm but alert. "Of course. Is there a problem? Can I see your ID, please?" George wiped his hands on the cloth and pulled a worn wallet from his back pocket. He handed over a retired Air Force ID card listing the basics. Name, date of birth, years of service. 32 years of service, Torres read aloud. "Everything seems to be in order, Mr. Murphy, but I'll need to ask you a few more questions." "Standard procedure." George nodded. "I understand. Why do you come here every day? What's your particular interest in this aircraft?" George looked at the F-105, then back at Torres. "I just like to keep it in good shape." Torres jotted down a few notes. The answer surprised him, but there was nothing suspicious about it. Plenty of veterans visited military bases out of nostalgia. You need special authorization to interact with display equipment. Mr. Murphy, I'm going to have to ask you to stop cleaning the plane until we can process the proper clearance. George stayed quiet for a long moment. His eyes drifted back to the aircraft, and Torres noticed something he couldn't quite describe. A deep sadness, like someone being forced to let go of something important. Of course, George finally said. I understand. He folded the cloth carefully, packed his cleaning supplies into a small bag, and walked toward his car. Before leaving, he turned one last time to look at the F-105. Torres felt a strange tightness in his chest. There was something in that look that disturbed him, not the look of someone caught doing something wrong. It was the look of someone being separated from home. In the days that followed, George didn't return. Dust began to gather on the F-105, and some base personnel quietly mentioned how they missed the familiar figure who had always been there, but the young pilots celebrated in hushed tones. Finally, someone dealt with the crazy old man. Blake said they didn't know the investigation had only just begun, and they had no idea that what was about to be uncovered would turn every mocking word they'd ever spoken into lasting regret. Could a hidden hero emerge from this silence? Colonel James Tyler was reviewing security reports when a familiar name caught his attention in Sergeant Torres's file. George Murphy. Tyler frowned. There was something about that name, something important that tugged at his memory, though he couldn't quite place it. He decided to dig deeper. 2 days later, he called Torres into a meeting at the command office. Sergeant, tell me more about this George Murphy, the man who was stopped from cleaning the F-105 at the front gate. Torres recounted the incident, describing George as a veteran who seemed to have a nostalgic attachment to the aircraft. Tyler nodded, but something still didn't sit right. He asked Torres to retrieve more detailed records on Murphy's military history while he checked the base archives himself. It was in the command room, surrounded by decades of historical photographs, that the truth finally surfaced. Tyler paused in front of a framed photo taken in 1972. The image showed a group of decorated pilots during a military honors ceremony, his eyes locked onto a young face at the center of the picture, a man in his early 30s. The plaque read, Lieutenant George Murphy, awarded the Air Force Cross for Extraordinary Valor Rescue Missions in Vietnam. Tyler felt a chill run down his spine. He quickly searched through more files, uncovering additional references to George Murphy, each one more astonishing than the last. George Murphy wasn't just another pilot. He was a legend. Between 1970 and 1973, he had led some of the most dangerous rescue missions of the Vietnam War, flying F-105 Thunder Chiefs deep into enemy territory to extract wounded soldiers and downed pilots. His records listed 47 combat missions, 12 successful extractions, and the documented saving of over 200 American lives. Tyler held the photo in trembling hands. The man who had been treated like an eccentric retiree by the young pilots was in fact one of the most decorated heroes the base had ever known. And for 3 years he had quietly cleaned the same model of aircraft he had flown on life-saving missions. When Torres returned with the requested files, he found Tyler still standing in front of the photograph, stunned. Sergeant, Tyler said, his voice steady but heavy. We've made a terrible mistake. The truth had finally come to light. But now they had to figure out how to make it right and how to explain to an entire base that they had treated a national hero like an inconvenient outsider. The next morning, General Harrison was visiting the base for a ceremony. Colonel Tyler approached him quietly, knowing that Harrison had served in Vietnam during the same years as George Murphy. General, do you remember a pilot named George Murphy from the 1970s? Harrison's face lit up instantly. George Murphy? My God, that man was the reason so many soldiers made it home to their families. He paused, noticing the worried look on Tyler's face. Why are you asking? Tyler explained the entire security investigation. With each detail, Harrison's expression grew darker. You're telling me? Harrison said slowly. That George Murphy was treated like a security threat at this base. Where is he now? We don't know. He hasn't come back since we told him to stay away. The general stood in silence, trying to process the information. He walked over to the window and stared out at the dusty F-105 standing at the base entrance. "Colonel Tyler, you disrespected him. That's unacceptable. Fix this immediately." Tyler picked up the phone and called the information office. "I need the home address of George Murphy, retired Air Force, right now." An hour later, Harrison and Tyler stood at the doorstep of George's small house. The general knocked on the door himself. George opened it, and the moment he saw the uniform, he instinctively straightened his posture. His eyes widened as he recognized the face. General Harrison. "Hello, George. May I come in?" The two men embraced. Two veterans reunited after decades. Harrison looked around the modest home, noticing the deliberate simplicity. There were no medals on display, no signs of the man's decorated past. "George, I owe you an apology on behalf of the entire Air Force." Then Harrison explained what had happened, how George had been treated, how his identity had been overlooked. George listened silently. He showed no anger, no bitterness. When Harrison finished, he simply said, "They didn't know, General." You can't blame people for what they didn't know. But you knew you were being mocked by recruits. You were told to stay off base by Sergeant Torres, and you never said a word. Never told anyone who you were. Why? George gave a faint, sad smile. What for? My time has passed. Those boys, they're the future of the Air Force. If they thought I was just an old man who liked to clean planes, then that's who I was. Harrison shook his head, once again, struck by the humility of the man who had once risked everything to save the lives of strangers. "George, I want you to come with me to the base. There are people who need to hear the truth because that general knew something important. Admitting our mistakes is the first step toward redemption. And some mistakes are too great to be corrected behind closed doors." Word spread through the base like wildfire. Within 2 hours, everyone knew the man who had been cleaning the F-105 wasn't just a retired airman. He was retired Major George Murphy, a decorated hero, a legendary pilot. The young airmen who had mocked him were devastated. Blake spent the entire afternoon in silence, replaying every cruel joke he had made. When George arrived at the base accompanied by General Harrison, a crowd had already gathered near the F-105. Officers, soldiers, staff, everyone wanted to see the man they were now hearing incredible stories about. Harrison raised a hand, asking for quiet, then addressed the crowd. "This is Major George Murphy," he announced. Between 1970 and 1973, he saved over 200 American lives, flying F-105 Thunder Chiefs on rescue missions in Vietnam. He was awarded the Air Force Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat. A wave of admiration swept through the crowd. George stood quietly, visibly uncomfortable with the attention. For 3 years. Harrison continued, Major Murphy cared for this aircraft, the very same model he flew in battle, without ever mentioning his past or seeking recognition. He did it out of love and respect for those who served. Major Murphy is one of the greatest heroes this base has ever known. Blake, who had started the cruel jokes, stepped forward. "Major Murphy," he said, his voice tight with emotion. We want to apologize. Our actions were inexcusable." George looked at the young men, Blake and Matthew, both standing with deep shame in their eyes. "You'll become honorable soldiers," George said. "You made a mistake, but your character is showing now in how you choose to face it." Matthew took a step forward. "Major, we'd like to do something to show our respect. If you'll allow it, we want to start a tradition here on base. Every day, a different service member will care for this F-105. In your honor, and in honor of every veteran who served before us." George stood silently for a moment, studying the young faces before him. Then he gave a genuine smile, warm and full of joy. "I accept." 6 months later, the Air Force Base inaugurated the Major George Murphy Memorial. A bronze plaque was placed beside the F-105, telling his story and honoring all the pilots who served in rescue missions. But the real memorial wasn't made of bronze. Every single morning without fail, a different service member arrived early to care for the F-105. George continued to show up each day. What he never told anyone, and what no one ever discovered, was that this wasn't just any aircraft. It was the exact plane he had flown decades earlier. To him, it was an old friend, one he could never walk away from. But now, he didn't work alone. Young soldiers made a point of joining him, listening to his stories about flying, about leadership, and about what it means to serve something greater than yourself. And every morning as the sun rises over the Arizona desert, a Thunder Chief gleams in the light. Cared for by people who learned that honoring the past isn't about statues or ceremonies. It's about tending to the memories that shaped us. And George Murphy, without ever intending to, became the teacher of that essential truth. If you enjoyed this story, let us know what you thought in the comments. And don't forget to click the like button and subscribe to Graceful Valor Stories so you don't miss the next. Subscribe to Graceful Valor Stories, where quiet strength is celebrated, and every hero's story finds a voice.